when we hear the word worship, what are some of the things that comes to our mind first? For some people, when they say worship, they think of the music. So it becomes something about contemporary versus the traditional. So some look at worship because of the music. Others, when they think about worship, they think about the message, that it revolves around the pastor or the preacher delivering a sermon. Others, when they think about worship, they think about giving an offering. And it's true that when we give an offering, that is an act of worship. Still, others, when they think of the word worship, they think of what is known as the order of the service or the liturgy. This is especially true in the more traditional, or we could say churches that practice a lot of rituals. But then, very often we think about the form, we think about the content of the worship. But when God talks about worship, it's beyond that. God is actually talking about holiness when He talks about worship. For Him, it is of supreme importance. Of course, order, form, these are prescribed in the Old Testament. And even in the New Testament, we find these things. But all of these, they must submit to God's call to a worship that is holy. This morning, we are beginning our study on the book of Leviticus, and in particular, chapter 19. This is a long passage that looks on the issue of holiness. So if you were to read the entire chapter, you will see that again and again, the emphasis is on holiness. And the focus of this morning is on holiness in the way we worship God. Now, we may begin to wonder, can we worship in any way, but in a holy way? And the answer is yes. Because we can be guilty of performing certain worship rituals, of observing certain traditions, of even regularly coming to a worship service like this. But we are doing all of these without a trace or a tinge of holiness. Especially when we fall into the trap of emphasizing the form over the substance. Or when we want to do things our way instead of doing things God's way. Or when we worship simply out of routine and schedule, without the intentionality, without the purpose. So there are moments that when we worship God, our worship may not be a holy form of worship. And there are many examples of these in the Bible. For example, if you remember in Exodus chapter 32, when the Israelites were left down while Moses went up to Mount Sinai. Remember what the people did? They made a golden calf. And then afterwards they said, let us hold a festival to worship the Lord. And so that was not a holy kind of worship because it went against God's law, especially the second commandment. And then another incident also found in Leviticus is, if you remember, a story about the sons of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu. They came before the altar of God and they made an offering. But this offering was made using fire that was unauthorized. And so because of that, God had them killed. And then in the prophetic books, God would rebuke the Israelites, both the lay people and the clergy, because their worship was not holy. Like for example, if you were to read the First and Second Kings, you will find that, for example, Jeroboam, he ordered the people that instead of going to Jerusalem, they could just stay in a particular place in the northern kingdom where they could worship God. However, his idea of worshiping God was for them to worship a golden calf. And then if you were to read other books the prophetic books, you will find incidents where people would keep household idols or household gods. Okay, so you could find that there were many ways in which the people of Israel did not worship God in a holy manner. And then in the New Testament, Jesus had harsh words for the religious leaders of the day. Why? Because they paid attention to the form, they paid attention to the rituals of worship, but they were not worshiping God in terms of substance, in terms of coming before a holy and righteous God. That was not first and foremost in their mind. So their worship was also not a holy form of worship. And so what exactly is worship that is holy? A moment ago we read a selection of verses from Leviticus 19. And from these you can derive important principles that we need to remember if we want our act of worship to be holy in the sight of God. Before that, let me share a bit about the background of Leviticus. Now, according to the NIV Study Bible, Leviticus 18 to 20, they were instructions given by God to the people of Israel. And these instructions govern interpersonal relationships and morality. And these three chapters, all of them, in a way, they talk about the holiness of God. In chapter 18, it talks about certain prohibitions in the moral sphere. Okay. And then in chapter 19, this is the expansion of the Ten Commandments. And it details what is correct morality or correct practice. And then chapter 20 will be the assessment of penalty for those who violate God's standard of morality. The reason why we had chapters 18 to 20 of Leviticus was because the Israelites were being prepared to enter into the Promised Land. You see, when they enter into the Promised Land, you have to remember that inside lived the Canaanites. And the Canaanites, they have a lifestyle that was immoral. And their immorality is not just physical, but their immorality is also expressed in their worship. Because they worship many kinds of gods and goddesses. And their practices of worship were, we could say, deplorable. Because they would sacrifice their children, they would indulge in promiscuity, all of them supposedly as acts of worship. And so God wanted His people, when they worship Him, they must be holy. And Leviticus 19 begins with that verse. In verse 2 it says, "You must be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy." And then throughout chapter 19, God reiterates again and again. In fact, He says these words 14 times. He says, "I am the Lord your God." Or he will say, "I am the Lord." What is the meaning behind that? It is an emphasis that He is the God of Israel. He is their master. The people of Israel, they are His subjects. They are His slaves, His servants. Therefore, if God is holy, they must also imitate Him in holiness. Now, just a side note, Leviticus 19, according to some scholars, has often been called the Old Testament Sermon on the Mount. We all know what the Sermon on the Mount is. Okay? In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus laid down rules for those who would be His subjects. And if you read the Sermon on the Mount, you know that Jesus covered a wide variety of topics. He talks about issues of the heart, right? Like, for example, he talks about murder, he talks about adultery. And then he also talks about issues like divorce. He talks about how we should give, how we should pray, how we should fast. Okay? All of these are, in some ways, they are like rules, okay, for the subjects, His subjects. Leviticus 19 is similar in that sense. It contains the ethical mandates that is expected of the people of God. Now, let's look at the word holy. This word holy is often misunderstood. We think of the word holy as being something abstract or mysterious, that it's limited to the spiritual realm. But the reality is this: when you say the word holy, holiness is practical. It affects us spiritually, yes, but then it overflows into daily life. Okay. It is also a personal responsibility. God makes us holy, yes, through the cross of Jesus. But then He also expects us to practice holiness every day in our different circumstances. Now, the basic meaning of holy is to be set apart, be it for a particular purpose. For example, God sets us apart in order to reflect His glory, so that is a purpose. Or, holiness means to be set apart for a particular person. In this case, we have been set apart for God's use. We are God's exclusive property. Okay, so that is the idea behind the word holiness, to be set apart. And so it connotes very strongly that we as God's people should no longer sin, or we should say no to sin. And we should say yes to God's rule and to God's way. That's the basic meaning of holiness. And so today's topic, which is about holiness in worship, it seems spiritual in its dimension. But the reality is that it affects everything else in life. Because a right worship of God affects our morality. It affects our business practices. It affects how we relate with other people. These are other topics that we will cover in the succeeding weeks. But then let's look at the principles that we can derive from the verses that we read a moment ago. The first principle about holiness, or how our worship can be holy, is we need to learn to respect God's authority. Respect God's authority. Look at verse 3. It says, "Each of you must respect his mother and father, and you must observe my Sabbath. I am the Lord, your God." Okay, so here, it begins with the command, respect our mother and father, our parents, and it is connected with the observance of the Sabbath. So you begin to wonder, so what does respect for parents have to do with holy worship of God? We have to remember this: the home, the family, it is God's ordained institution. And parents are our fathers and our mothers. They stand in the place of God, or as representatives of God, as far as the children are concerned. And so children are supposed to give the proper respect to their parents as if they were showing respect to God Himself. You see, children, as they are growing up, their impression of God is formed in terms of their relationship with their parents. So if they see that their parents are loving, if they see that their parents are compassionate people, they know how and when to discipline them, okay, and give the right reason why they discipline and all of that, it gives a positive image about God to the children. Okay. And so that's why children are called to respect their mothers and fathers. The Old Testament scholar, R.K. Harrison, he wrote a commentary on Leviticus. He said, "Revering one's parents is an act of piety towards God, since the parents are substitutes for the Heavenly Father as far as their children are concerned. The reverencing of one's parents as surrogates of God is but one step from the venerating of God Himself." Or in other words, he's simply saying that when we learn to respect our fathers and our mothers, it is as if we are already respecting God Himself. So children, we have to show respect to our parents by obeying them when they tell us to do that which is morally right. To honor them by caring for them, because in doing so, we are respecting God's authority. And we are worshiping God in a holy manner. And so you see, okay, even though we are told to make our worship holy, yet there's a connection already with our relationship with our parents. But then you may be wondering, so what is the connection between the Sabbath and the honoring of parents? Parang layo, diba? Okay. Actually, there is a connection according to a Jewish scholar. This is what he said. We honor our parents because they are our most direct creators through the natural order God ordained. Right? They are our most direct creators. We came out from our mother's womb. We are the product of our father and our mother's intimacy, right? So, they are our most direct creator. On the other hand, when we talk about the Sabbath, we keep the Sabbath in order to celebrate creation and to honor our Creator. And so you can see that honoring our parents, keeping the Sabbath, this is how the Jewish scholars actually connected the two ideas. Okay, it's all about creation, it's all about the Creator. And so, here's a challenge. Have we done our best to honor and respect our parents? Because when we respect our parents, when we honor them, we are actually showing our respect for God. And so show your respect by obeying them and caring for them. However, for those who are parents here, I want to give a warning to you. Okay? Yes, the passage tells us that the children should honor their parents. But it doesn't mean that parents, you can do anything you want, even bad things to your children. Okay? Because they are commanded to respect you anyway. Yes, they should respect you, but you, on the other hand, according to the Apostle Paul, it says, do not, in Ephesians, do not exasperate your children. Okay? Yes, you may be representatives of God in the institution of the family. But remember this, you are not God. You are not the object of worship. You are simply His representatives. And you have flaws. You have imperfections. You have sins. And so God expects you to be your best. To rightly show who God is to your children through your words and your actions. And then you must also help them to know the Lord and to worship Him. And so, remember that, parents. Okay? While children are commanded to obey and to respect you, you must do your part. Do not exasperate them, but to lead them in the fear of the Lord. And so that's our first lesson that we can learn. We must respect the authority of God. Secondly, we have to reflect on the reality of who God is by observing the Sabbath. Observing the Sabbath. Again, looking at verse 3, we are commanded, observe the Sabbath. And then in verse 30, again, it says, observe my Sabbath. And this time it's connected with the sanctuary. Observe my Sabbath and have reverence for my sanctuary. Now, the Sabbath was a time of rest that God not only commanded, but He Himself practiced in relation to the work of creation. In Genesis 1, we learned this, that God created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day, He rested. Now, the Sabbath is a time of rest from our labor, as patterned by God Himself. Now, of course, God does not get tired. God actually does not need a rest. But He patterned it because He knows that we need rest. We all need to have a break physically. emotionally, and mentally from our work and from our daily routine. And when I say have a break, I'm not just saying take a few minutes to have a Kit Kat. Okay? That's not a break. Okay? Here, God is saying take a day off. However, when God mandated the Sabbath, it was not simply to rest our bodies and our minds. It was also a time for us to find rest in God and to trust in God's provision. You know, some people, even Christians, are guilty of this. They work or they open their stores even on Sundays, and the reason that they give is because they need the additional income. 6 days of work for them is not enough to provide for 7 days of expenses. That would be the rationale of some people. But then God is telling us that we need to rest our bodies. Why? Because our bodies need to recharge. And He's also telling us, you have to stop worrying and start trusting in my ability and my willingness to provide. That's why He tells us, take the day off. I will take care of you on that day. That's why one of the best examples would be, if you remember when God provided manna, what did He tell the Israelites when it was Friday? He tells them, on Friday you collect double, right? Because on Saturday you're not supposed to work. No manna is going to appear on the ground on Saturday. And so the idea there is that God will take care of you. God will provide for your needs on the day that you stop working, or when you take a break. And so it's the reason why we have to observe the Sabbath. God is going to provide for us, and God wants us to rest our bodies. But then the Sabbath is not only because of these things, it's also a time for us to reflect on the reality of who God is. Back then, the Israelites were supposed to spend time meditating on the goodness of God to them. They were to think about God's character. They were to respond to that meditation by giving glory to Him. In other words, Sabbath day was supposed to be a time for them to think about God and to worship God. Now, verse 30, a moment ago, I said that there's a connection. There's the Sabbath and there is revering of the sanctuary. What does it mean? It simply means that the people of Israel were supposed to not just rest their bodies, but they were supposed to worship the Lord together in the sanctuary. God never intended the Sabbath for us to do what we want, but it was intended for us to worship the Lord corporately, for us to spend time thinking about the Lord. Now, of course, as Christians, we don't have a literal Sabbath day in the sense that we don't observe Saturday, right? But we do have Sunday as what we call as the Lord's Day. But the sad thing is that many people today, they violate the principle of the Sabbath. We may not observe the Sabbath as being Saturday, but we deliberately violate the principles. Now, for most of us, yes, Sunday is our day of rest. But some people have made Sunday, like in the upper left picture, Sunday, okay, sleep until you're hungry, then eat until you're sleepy. Okay, that's their idea of Sunday. Okay. So they sleep till 12 noon, they get up, they eat brunch, then go back to sleep. Okay, that is not the idea that God has for the day of rest. That we become like pigs who just eat and sleep. Okay. Some people make the day of rest as nothing more than a time to go to the mall because, everyone's going to the mall anyway. The mall opens at 10 a.m. And we want to be there first so that we can have the best parking space. And so they spend all day shopping, watching movies, eating. Others, they go out of town. Nothing wrong with that, but they leave early in the morning, come back late at night, and throughout the day, they never think about God. Or they don't even take time to worship God. Or for some, Sunday is the day to play sports. Because everyone is available. So some people are guilty of this. But then let me also say this. There are many Christians who regularly attend church, but they are also guilty of violating the Sabbath. How? Some people, when they come to church, they have this attitude. They have the attitude where they say, okay, God, I'm here in church, I fulfilled my religious obligation. However, as they sit there in the pew, their attention is not focused on God. And to be very frank and honest, I've seen some people who come to church when I'm not preaching, when I'm not at the back, I've seen some people playing video games on their cell phone. So they are physically present, but spiritually and mentally they're absent. And I guess that many of them have that attitude where they're sort of saying to God, okay God, I'm here. I have fulfilled my obligation. Then there are some who come to church for personal and selfish reasons. Like, I come to church to meet up with my friends because I don't get to meet them from Monday to Saturday. And this is especially true, like, for example, if you've been classmates for so many years from elementary to high school, and then all of a sudden when you went to college, you went to different schools. Okay? And so the only time that you can sort of have your reunion is on a Sunday. Okay? And so what do you do on a Sunday worship? You talk to each other, regardless of who's talking in front. Okay, I've seen that also when I'm at the back. So that's why you better be careful when I'm at the back, because I'm observing. Okay. And then some people, they come to church in order to do business or to complete a sales transaction. Again, this time not people inside the church, but sometimes around the church facility, they talk about business, and sometimes they're seated, they're transacting a business deal. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that doing a business deal is bad, but I think that we should reserve that for another day. Okay. You see, God has given us a day of rest so that we can cease from our labor, so that we can cease from our anxieties. And the intention of the Sabbath is so that we can go to Him. We can draw near to Him for strength. That we can go to Him and bring our thanksgiving to Him and to worship Him for who He is and what He has done for us. It's okay if on a Sunday you go to a mall. It's okay if you travel. It's okay if you play sports. But never neglect the time to reflect on God and to worship Him. That's why we have to make it our first and our top priority that on the Sunday, we must worship the Lord. Worship should not be an afterthought. Like, I know that there are churches inside malls. And it's very convenient. Even I like the idea. But for some worshipers, it's an afterthought. Okay, we go shopping, we watch movie, we do all of these things. Then we'll attend the 6 p.m. service. Okay, after we have done everything to entertain ourselves. I don't think that's a right perspective. But instead, God should not be an afterthought. He should be the first thought. He should be our first priority. And so holy worship takes place when we learn to rest on God and to rest from our labor, and then we spend time to meditate on Him, to worship Him, to give thanks to Him. And so, reflect on God's goodness, on who He is, by observing the Sabbath. Thirdly, for our worship to be holy, we have to renounce the following: idolatry, occultism and distorted pictures of God. Leviticus 19:4 says, "Do not turn to idols or make gods of cast metal for yourselves. I am the Lord your God." And then in verse 31, "Do not turn to mediums or seek out spiritists, for you will be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God." Why was this warning given? It was because they were entering into the promised land where the people worship idols, where the people practiced occultism. Also, they were not to discard God's revelation of Himself and then adhere to gods of their own making and imagination. And so the rationale was because they were supposed to be a distinct people. They should be different from the pagans who lived in the land. The Canaanites, they worship a multitude of gods. They do a lot of immoral and reprehensible stuff associated with the worship of gods. And so the Israelites, they were not supposed to worship like them because they were supposed to be distinct. But secondly, there's another factor, that is this. Anything they worship other than the one true God will eventually, quote-unquote, eat them alive or destroy them. That's the reason why they were not supposed to worship other gods. But then when we talk about idolatry, idolatry is not just the worship of other gods. Idolatry is also when we falsely depict Yahweh God as an image. Israel was guilty of this particular sin. If you remember again the golden calf incident in Exodus 32, the Israelites, when they saw the golden calf, they said, "These are the gods who have brought us out of Egypt." That was what they said. But then Aaron, he then says, "Okay, let us have a festival to be held for the worship of Yahweh." That was what Aaron said. And so the people heeded the words of Aaron and they worshiped Yahweh according to their own understanding, according to the conception of their own mind. And this contradicted the command of God. They said, "This is Yahweh God, a cow." Okay? And they worshiped that cow or that image of the cow and said that this is God. And that is in contradiction of what God commanded. That they were not supposed to make images. And then, let me talk about occultism. Now, God forbade the Israelites from practicing occultism because not only will they be failing to worship Him properly, but occultism is like playing with fire. Because whenever you consult a medium or a spiritist, you are confessing that God is unable to answer your prayers. And so what you are doing is you choose to consult the evil spirits. Now for the Canaanites, this was a common practice. But Israel was warned, do not have anything to do with it. Because when you do it, you become susceptible to demonic influences. I believe we all understand idolatry. Because for some of us, we have experienced it firsthand, even I myself. Because I remember when I was still young, I have entered the Buddhist temple. And I have burned my share of incense. Okay? And I have bowed before an image of Buddha before. And I have listened to the chanting of certain prayers. So I've experienced that when I was very young. Then of course, as you have the opportunity to travel abroad, you get to see a lot of these, the worship of Buddha in other countries, or the Hindu gods, and Shinto. And then we see people, they make and worship gods other than Yahweh, other than Jesus. And these images are made of wood, iron, or stone. Today we also have idols that we may not call them as gods, but we unknowingly worship them. Particularly three things: sex, money, and power. Okay, we were talking about this in our small group yesterday. And these are our modern day idols, especially for the men. Sex, money, and power. But then there are many other forms of gods that we create. Philosophies, maybe other people. We adore them to the point of as if we are worshiping them. But then there are also some people today who depict God wrongly. For example, for those in the Catholic faith, they have the Santo Niño and the Black Nazarene. These are in many ways false depictions of who Jesus is. The Santo Niño is a false depiction because Jesus is always an infant. And then if you read some of the stories, it sounds rather bizarre. It's as if the Santo Niño can do naughty things. Okay? He could play a prank on you. Okay, I read that and I was saying to myself as I read that, I said, how can this be Jesus? Okay? Jesus, I don't think ever plays naughty pranks on people. Okay? Or we would never do things to harm others. And then of course the Black Nazarene, it depicts, it's not about the color, by the way, but it's about Jesus, okay, always bearing that cross, always suffering. We know that that's not true. Jesus suffered once and for all. He died once and for all. And today He is glorified. He is in heaven. And He acts as our great high priest. And so, these images gives us a false picture of Jesus. Then of course, we know that in the Catholic faith, they pray to dead saints, and as well as to the mother of Jesus, rather than to Jesus Himself. So that in itself is a form of idolatry. But then, even for us, we who belong to the Christian faith, sometimes we depict God in a wrong way. For example, if you adhere to the prosperity gospel, you will always view God as someone who blesses materially and who always wants you to have a good life. And so that's, in a way, a wrong picture of God, because God does not promise that He will always give us material blessings. God never promised that we will always have a good life, the way that we think of good life. But He does promise us that when we follow Him, we will have a life that is meaningful, a life that is abundant, in the sense that Jesus is in us. There is meaning to the life that we live here on earth. And so, all of these things that we talk about, these are wrong depictions of God. Now, today we also have people who dabble in occultism. They visit fortune tellers, mediums, spiritists. We have people who visit feng shui experts, and they think it's harmless, but they don't realize that they are opening themselves up to the influences of Satan. And so to participate in occultic practices, even out of ignorance, and then coming to worship God on a Sunday, is to offer a worship that is not holy. A worship that is not acceptable to God. And also, when you practice superstitions, it's an act of worshiping the devil. That's why we should not believe in things like, 13 is an unlucky number and so is 4. Okay? We should not believe those things. Don't believe that a black cat is unlucky. Okay? Don't be afraid of the ghost month, okay? Especially for those who are Chinese. Don't be afraid of that. Why? Because these are superstitions. These are worship. These are acts of worship towards Satan. We worship the one true God. We don't need to be afraid of those things. We don't need to practice those things. And so, examine yourself. Are there false gods or false pictures of Yahweh that you hold on to? Are there forms of idolatry that you practice? Are there certain occultic practices that you are doing that maybe you're ignorant of what you have done? You have to renounce them. And one that I think you need to be careful of is the one at the right. It's a fortune teller named Solcar. It's actually an arcade game. I've seen this in Fisher Hall. Okay? In a arcade booth, okay? You drop money and then out comes a card with your fortune. It seems innocent, but it is not. And so we need to be careful, because that is one step towards practicing occultism. And then finally, when we talk about holy worship, we must relish our fellowship with God. And this is in Leviticus 19, verses 5 to 8. This passage is about the fellowship offering. This is one of the many sacrifices that the people of Israel would bring to God. But then there's a difference between the fellowship offering and all other offerings. And it is this. The fellowship offering was not exactly something that was required, in the sense that you have to bring it. Not like, say, the sin offering, the burnt offering. These were for the sins of the people. But the fellowship offering was more about my relationship with God. And then also the fellowship offering was the only offering or sacrifice that the offerer could partake of. All the others, you had to either burn it completely or it becomes the property of the priest. This one, however, you could participate in part of it. And the meat that was offered could be partaken of for a maximum of 2 days. But if there were portions left over on the 3rd day, this had to be disposed by fire. Now, according to the NIV Study Bible, the fellowship offering carries 2 ideas. The first is that the offering symbolized peace or wholeness. When we come before God and we bring this offering, it means that God, you and I, we have peace. Our relationship is okay. And then second, the offerer has fellowship with God on the basis of the sacrifice. In other words, because there was a previous sacrifice that was made, maybe a sin offering that was made already. So after the sin offering, you are made right with God. Then of course, a person, he may choose to offer a fellowship offering. Now in this offering, the idea is this: God graciously shares with those who do not deserve it. That's why this is the only offering where the people could partake of. The idea was that God is willing to share. He was telling the Israelites, you are accepted in my sight. Not because of anything you have done, not because of even of what you brought before me, but because of my grace. I offer my grace. Therefore, whenever an Israelite offers a fellowship offering, they should come with a spirit of gladness, they should come with joy, because they're being invited by God to feast with Him, to enjoy not just the food, but to enjoy His presence. But then, there's a condition that is set here. It says that the meat that is not consumed on the 3rd day must be burned or disposed. And failure would mean that the person will be cut off from the rest of the people because they have desecrated what is holy. The idea is this: God wants to have fellowship with the Israelites, but the condition that was given is a warning that sin and disobedience will not be taken lightly. And all those who come before God with sin, with disobedience, cannot enjoy fellowship with Him. Today, we don't need to offer a fellowship offering. Why? Because Jesus has become the sacrifice. Jesus has come, He has taken away all of our sins, and He has already made us right with God. He has made us right with other people. But then we must not miss the point, the sacrifice. It's all about enjoying our relationship with God. Jesus has already made that possible. We can come before God. But then, enjoying His presence is something that we must learn to do. And how can we do that? We have to remember that we are blessed immensely. Especially when we talk about the spiritual blessings. We have received so much from God. And so because we have received so much from God, we should learn to enjoy our relationship with God. At the same time, we must always remember the warning that we must do away with sin. Why? Because sin hinders our relationship with God. That's why we are commanded, yes, relish our relationship, but be sure to remove the things that will hinder that fellowship with God. So that's the fourth principle to remember. Enjoy or relish your relationship. And so in closing, think about this. Is your worship holy? God is calling us to worship Him in a manner that is acceptable to Him. A manner that is different from the pagans, that is different from those who do not know God. And we are blessed that we have this revelation from Leviticus 19. Leviticus 19 is not supposed to be observed just, to the letter. But instead, we must understand the principle. That's why today, what I've brought you is the principle. What we should observe when we worship the Lord, so that our worship can be holy. Right now, I want you to take out your handouts, and I want you to look at the last part. It says personal applications. I want you to take a few minutes to just examine yourself and to make some action steps in the area of holy worship. I just have some suggestions here. So, if you're not yet showing respect to your parents, it's affecting your worship of God. So think of how you can show respect to them. What are some things that you can do this week, or maybe throughout this year? Maybe one thing or two things that you can do to show respect to your parents. Also, maybe you haven't been keeping the day of rest. So think of how you can do that, or what particular area you need to improve upon, so that you can really say that you are observing the Sabbath rest. And then thirdly, are there idols that you need to renounce? Maybe there's still something in your home that you haven't disposed of. You think of that Thai Buddha image as being just a decoration in your home, but it's not. Okay? It's still Buddha. Okay? So you better dispose of that. Or maybe there are wrong ideas of God that you have to dispose of. And then ask Jesus to remove the hold of any idol in your life. Okay? Things that are not figures, okay? Maybe ideas, philosophies, you have to remove those. And then, of course, what about setting aside time to be with the Lord alone? Maybe you haven't been doing your quiet time. Maybe you don't practice having personal retreat. This would be a good time to do that, because these are actions that you can do in order to worship God, to have a Sabbath rest. Okay? So take a few minutes to just think of your own action steps. What do you want to do this week? What do you want to do for the whole month, or for the rest of the year, to show that you are serious about making your worship a worship that is good? And after you've written your personal application, I want you to just take time to pray and ask the Lord to help you to be able to apply that in your life. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this particular chapter in Leviticus that gives us the principles of how we can worship you in a manner that is pleasing, that is holy. Lord, we know that all of us here, we have worshipped you in a way that does not reflect your holiness. And so we ask for forgiveness. We pray right now also that whatever we have written down or whatever is in our mind, that which we plan to apply, may you grant us the strength, the perseverance, and the grace to keep that application, to observe it. And Father, may our worship indeed be pleasing to you. We thank you and we pray this in Jesus' name.